Greetings. Now, before I proceed and actually cite the clip that I'll be addressing, let me say at the outset that I have nothing against Sargon of Akkad, either as a person or as a content producer. I think largely that what he does is good, and it's a fight worth fighting, even though I would personally find it far too tedious to cite feminist this and that constantly. But nevertheless, I think what he's doing is a good thing. So this is nothing personal against Sargon of Akkad. However, during his interview with Aaron Pizzey, which I would suggest all of you watch, because it's always nice to listen to a woman who had lived through various things and can testify to the past, and it was pretty good. But during this talk with Aaron Pizzey, he made a brief statement that I think is symbolic in its fundamental flawedness, essentially, which is to say that I've talked about this before in terms of denialism. It's very difficult, even in an anti-feminist camp, to be completely intellectually honest. So let me first play the clip, and we'll talk about what's problematic with what he's saying, and of course, about the larger implications of what he's saying and basically reactions in the anti-feminist camp. So let's have a listen.
And so he suddenly found himself ousted. And again, because in the whole custody organization, the woman automatically has custody. The man has to beg her for permission to see his own children.
But through no fault of his own either.
No.
And the thing is, one thing that annoys me about these is, I mean, like we were saying, I personally have always viewed women as human beings, and I think that any human beings, there are certain types of people who, given the right incentives, will act on those incentives because they are, well, I guess fundamentally a bit more selfish than others. And this isn't a gendered issue. This is just, there are people like this.
Yeah.
And so if you were to give men all, a series of systematic advantages in this way, you would have certain men who would take advantage of them. And I think, like, the reverse is now here true. Women who, they see that they can have the advantage of the house, the kids, state funding, and the enforcement of the man's wages being sort of garnished or whatever, and they're going to do it just because they can.
Now, the informed amongst you can probably instantly see what's problematic with this statement. And once again, nothing against Sargon of Akkad as a content producer, as a person. But let me just first say, I think he might have made this statement, and then the charitable interpretation of this, because he actually believes that, as opposed to more cynical reasons such as he's afraid to offend people. Who knows, ultimately? Regardless, we know that this statement is not correct. The first thing I want to point out is that when no-fault divorce went on the table, when it became an option, it was, as Aaron Pizzey herself in the video says, 74% of the people doing it were women. And this statistic, and you can search the internet for just dozens of publications on this, but I'll put some in the low bar just in case you want to double check. The statistic of about 70%, give or take, and there's some reduction and some increase depending on the decade, has remained consistent ever since there's been a no-fault divorce, meaning since there's been no-fault divorce, 70% of the divorces have been initiated by women, okay? Which is not to say, and that's the whole point, that technically and legally no-fault divorce is not available to men. Obviously, 30% of men still initiate divorce. The problem here is that divorce is, by and large, mostly initiated by women. A great majority of divorces initiated by women, whilst men still have the option. So men have the option of divorcing just as women do, and yet they don't. So right there, this puts sort of a screw in the claim of, well, men would act in exactly the same way if given the same incentives. We can talk about the incentives in a bit, but the fact is that no-fault divorce exists as an option for both men and women. However, the vast majority of people taking advantage of it are women, not men. Now, another thing that needs to be added, and I'll be posting links to this as well, the reason, even to this day, why women initiate divorce in the majority of cases, as opposed to men, is not so they can get a payout. Yes, most of the time they get custody, they get assets, but that's not the reason cited. The reason why women get divorced most of the time is, as Karen Strawn put it quite recently, they're just not feeling it anymore. Now, I'll be reading off a site by a marriage counselor, this guy who has lots of experience with marriage and dealing with divorce and threats of divorce. And we'll see what he has to say. This guy, he's written books on the subject. William F. Harley Jr., Ph.D. So we'll read this off and then we'll talk about this a little bit more. This will be in low bar as well. Women tend to be more concerned about their marriages than men. They buy most of the books on marriages to try to improve them and initiate most marriage counseling. They often complain about their marriages to their closest friends and sometimes to anyone who will listen. And they also file for divorce twice as often as men. Why do women seem so dissatisfied with marriage? What do they want from their husbands? What bothers them so much about marriage that most are willing to risk their family's future to escape it? Why do women leave men? Each day, I am confronted by women who are extremely frustrated with their marriages. They usually express no hope that their husbands will ever understand what it is that frustrates them, let alone change enough to solve the problem. From their perspective, marital problems are created by their husbands who do little to nothing to solve them. Wives tend to see themselves as the major force for resolving conflicts, and when they give up their effort, the marriage is usually over. When I talk to their husbands, they usually have a very different explanation as to why their wives feel the way they do. They often feel that the expectations of women in general, and their wives in particular, have grown completely out of reach. These men who feel that they've made a gigantic effort to be caring and sensitive to their wives get no credit whatsoever for their sizable contribution to the family. They feel under enormous pressure to improve their financial support, improve the way they raise their children, improve the way they treat their wives. Many men I see are emotionally exhausted and feel that for all their effort, they get nothing but criticism. The simpler role of husbands in decades past has now been replaced by a much more complex and confusing role, especially in their relationship with their wives. Some conclude that women are born to complain and men must ignore it to survive. Others feel that women have come to expect so much of men that they are impossible to please, so there's no point in even trying. Very few men these days feel that they have learned to become husbands that their wives have wanted, and the job seems to be getting more and more difficult. And we move on then to grounds for divorce. So here we have grounds for divorce. Men's perceived failure to satisfy their wives is punctuated by the fact that women file for divorce twice as often as men. In other words, their unhappiness with marriage often results in divorce. So let's stick with that. Their unhappiness in marriage. The reason why they're filing for divorce is that they're unhappy. The most common reason women give for leaving their husbands is quote-unquote mental cruelty. When legal grounds for a divorce are stated, about half report that they have been emotionally abused. But the mental cruelty they describe is rarely the result of their husband's efforts to drive them crazy. It is usually their husbands being indifferent, failing to communicate, and demonstrating other forms of neglect. Another reason for divorce reported almost as much as mental cruelty is quote-unquote neglect itself. These include both emotional abandonment and physical abandonment. Husbands that work away from home, sometimes leaving their wives alone for weeks at a time, fall into this category. And I should add, as my own addendum, paying the bills for their wives, supporting their families. But hey, when all forms of spousal neglect are grouped together, we find that it is far ahead of all other reasons combined that women leave men. Surprisingly, few women divorce because of physical abuse, infidelity, alcoholism, criminal behavior, fraud, or other serious grounds. Okay, so you get the gist. Now, the point I'm trying to make here, and the point this marriage expert is making here as well, is that despite the fact that there can be a payout at the end, back in the day when no-fault divorce came onto the table, the payout that women could potentially get was not the primary motivation. It was, quote-unquote, being happy or unhappy or being discontent or suffering mental cruelty because the husband was working too hard to pay the bills and support the wife's lifestyle while all the while she felt neglected. So the payout is not the motivation for women initiating divorce, and it never has been. Not the primary one. Yeah, there'll probably be some cases where they think, oh, I can get lifelong alimony, particularly in California. But the reason why women get divorced is because they're just not feeling it anymore. The majority of reasons. There are, of course, some cases where it's actual abuse, but they're not content. The husband isn't satisfied emotionally, isn't paying enough attention. Frivolous reasons, basically. What, at least formally, would have been referred to as frivolous grounds for getting a divorce. So they are initiating divorce for frivolous reasons. Now, there are other data that suggest, and I'll be posting a link to this in Lowbar, you want to read up on it, many of these men are surprised. There was one study that cited that 26% of the husbands never saw it coming. They had no idea there were quote-unquote problems in the marriage. So the reason why these women were divorcing and continue to divorce in the same 70% range as today as they did 40, 50 years ago is not because of the payout. The payout is a net benefit, and I'm sure they're happy for it, but they do it because they're just not feeling it anymore. They're not happy. And frankly speaking, what the evidence suggests is that women are much more frivolous about marriage than men are. Men are more willing to stick things out. That's for sure. We see by the divorce statistics. And they're more content to just with things that women aren't content with. Women become dissatisfied very easily. Now, this puts a wrench in, rather than a screw, I misspoke earlier, a wrench in the idea that, if the situation were reversed, men would behave in exactly the same way. Well, the situation doesn't need to be reversed. Men have the same options. They might not have the same options in terms of payout, right? Although in a place like Germany, where I live, if you earn less as a man, generally speaking, you get the payout in terms of alimony. That doesn't change the fact that in Germany, like pretty much every country on earth, 70% of the divorces are initiated by women. So given the fact that there are countries, apart from the UK, essentially from the Anglosphere, United States, Canada, where the division of assets is more equitable, particularly in Scandinavia, where you don't have this process at all, women still stay 70% of the statistic that initiates the divorce. So you can't explain this just by saying, oh, well, it's reverse. Men would do exactly the same thing. They don't, because you have other countries that don't give you a payout when you're divorced, and women are still initiating the divorce and don't want to be married, right? Now, the problem with statements such as, I believe women are human too. Of course they're human. That's absolutely true. But the statement is deceptively simplistic. There are different kinds of humans, and men and women are radically different from each other in what motivates them. And we can see this by means of looking at the divorce statistics. Men aren't nearly as dissatisfied in their marriages as women so as to initiate divorce, and they are the small minority of divorces, right? This tells us something about the fundamental mentalities of men and women. As soon as no-fault divorce became an option for women, huge, vast numbers took advantage of it, but the men did not in the numbers that women did, right? And it wasn't because of the payout. Once again, that isn't borne out by the evidence, because you have other countries like Germany and Scandinavia where women would not get a huge payout, even if they get some alimony. Now, one way you can test this, that is that men and women have very different behaviors, that you can't simply make a blanket statement such as, we're all human. Yeah, that's true, but we're different kinds of humans, is to look at the divorce rates in gay marriages, specifically the differences between gay, that is male homosexual divorce rates versus female homosexual divorce rates, or lesbian. So I'll be posting links to these studies and some of this other stuff in the low bar, but I'll read some of this off. A recent study offers the first systematic review of same-sex unions and divorce rates based on accurate National Register data in Sweden from the 1990s. The study found that gay male couples were 1.5 times as likely, or 50% more likely, to divorce as married opposite-sex couples, while lesbians were 2.67 times as likely, 167% more likely to divorce as opposite-sex married couples over a similar period of time. Even after controlling for demographic characteristics associated with increased risk of divorce, male same-sex couples were 1.35 times as likely, 35% more likely to divorce, and lesbians were 3 times as likely, 200% more likely to divorce as opposite-sex married couples. And some more information on this within Scandinavia, what I was talking about. The divorce rates of the women initiated divorce rates are the same, even though there isn't a payout comparable to the UK or the United States. So this is from a little article here. I'll be posting a link to this. So, however, the low gay divorce rate may have as much to do with gender as sexual orientation, Nissen believes. The vast majority of gay marriages in Denmark are male-male, and only 14% of these end in divorce compared to 23% of female marriages, and this is in Denmark. The higher rate for lesbians is consistent with data showing that women initiate most of the heterosexual divorces in Denmark. In the United States, women request about 2/3, that's actually higher, of divorces. Quote, women simply expect different things from marriage than men do, says Nissen, and if they don't get them, they prefer to live alone. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here and demonstrate here is that the statement that, I don't know if that's exactly what Sargon was saying, and maybe he can qualify that, but men and women are different. We're both human, but we're different kinds of humans. In fact, Professor Mills, professor of evolutionary psychology, had stated that we might as well be a subspecies of the same species. That's how different we are. The evidence suggests that men, in fact, in general, will not do exactly what women did and do with regards to no-fault divorce, just as women in general will do that. So yes, there are selfish men and selfish women, and if we want to classify selfishness, we can say there might be different types of selfishness for all I care. Different, male selfishness, female selfishness. But when it comes to the realm of divorce, there's just no evidence that really on hand that we have to support the idea that men would be initiating divorce en masse just as women do. Now, I'm not excluding the possibility that if there were some completely other realm, something else that could exploit the male psychology more, yeah, you probably would get a greater rate of occurrence with males doing whatever that might be, although nothing comes to mind. But we see, one, women since the get-go, since the outset of no-fault divorce, have consistently been initiating divorce at 70% rate, more or less, to 30% of men, give or take. The payout was not the motivation, at least initially. These women, when they first got a divorce, didn't think they were going to strike it rich. According to some sources, women actually lose some degree of standard of living. And in Scandinavian countries, as well as Germany and other countries, you don't get a massive alimony payout most of the time. And yet the divorce rates in terms of who initiates divorce, which sex does, women initiating the vast majority of them, are consistent with the same divorce initiation as in the United States and other countries. Basically, across the globe, women initiate divorce 70% of the time. Now, I'm not going to repeat that anymore. I've said this many, many times. But here's the secondary problem. It seems to me that even in the anti-feminist camp, you cannot be completely intellectually honest. And I'm going to assume that Sargon just hadn't thought the statement through, particularly when he made that statement, hadn't done the research, hadn't looked at the stats. Who knows what his ultimate motivation was. But I can tell you that when you point things out that are unsavory towards women, you tend to get responses that call you divisive. I talked about this in my denialism video. So I got a response from some guy called Evil Religion when I initially left a comment on Sargon's video. He says, yes, but no-fault divorces are really not an option for men. Well, technically they are. Yes, they can initiate them, but then they lose their house, their kids, their fair chance. But this wasn't always the case, particularly when it was first on the table. Women didn't know they would be getting everything the minute it was proclaimed that they could engage in no-fault divorce. And once again, the reasons why women engage in no-fault divorce and just divorce their husbands seemingly willy-nilly is because they're just not feeling it anymore. They feel emotionally neglected or their husband works too much. It's not to get a massive payout. And if some sources are to be believed, their standard of living actually drops. So he says, so whilst technically exists, no sane man would ever opt to do it, blah, 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 blah. And of course, he goes on to the sort of all humans are the same. Many people are selfish and will take advantage of a situation if they can. But I have no real doubt that if the tables were turned, the instigation of divorce rates would swap as well. Once again, it's not borne out by the evidence because not every country gives you a massive alimony payout. Only the Anglo-Saxon ones, well, not only, but certainly in the West, primarily the Anglo-Saxon ones do. All right? And then he goes on to say, the selfishness and bad behavior is no more a male trait. than a female trait, and to start to think so is the very cornerstone of the whole gender politics nonsense. We must avoid such divisive thinking. So I'm not saying that selfishness is the sole province of women, by any means. All human beings can be selfish. But what I am saying is that there are certain types of behavior that occur at a much higher rate in women than they do in men. And the frivolous divorce is one of them. Now, I'm sure you can find other kinds of behavior that occurs much more often in men than women, but we're talking about divorce here. We're talking about the reasons why women divorce. And the reasons are not a payout. Now, this is the denialism and obscurantism that I've talked about often enough in the past. These people, even the anti-feminists, right, they are unfortunately not willing to lay all the cards out on the table. Now, a charitable interpretation is this: they just don't know. The guy doesn't know the stats. He hasn't thought it through. He hasn't thought about the details. But I presented evidence just now. The fact that there are plenty of countries where you don't get a big divorce settlement or payout, and women still do most of the divorcing. Now, of course, Aaron suggested in the video that women have been tricked. We've heard this before. Well, if that's the case, I guess women are pretty gullible. So that's not a particularly nice thing to say about women. We cannot proceed ahead and be intellectually honest if we cannot honestly talk about these things without worrying about being quote-unquote divisive. Now, I'm not politically correct, and I'm not trying to please anyone. I'm just interested in the facts and what's true. But it's not enough just to oppose feminism and say feminism is bad, rah, 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 which unfortunately most anti-feminists do without going into the details. So let me ask some tough questions, and perhaps some tough questions to Sargon or any of his subscribers, and I'm a subscriber too, so I'm asking myself this too. If all these women are now joining the anti-feminist women, and they're all against feminism, are they willing to repeal no-fault divorce? Are they willing to repeal maternity leave and willing to get rid of WIC and women's welfare and all of this stuff? That's the real test. If they say, yeah, we need to get rid of this stuff, blah, 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 maybe there'd be some evidence that they're actually sincere. But until that happens, and until women actually talk about that vocally, all I see anti-feminist women is being part of another label that seems to be mildly popular. It's the next cool thing. And the men being anti-feminist, frankly speaking, aren't serious enough, in my opinion. If they're not willing to cite the facts and talk about the evidence, when it doesn't necessarily make them look good, that's a problem. So once again, I'm not doing this to be divisive. I don't care. I mean, I'm divisive. Me making this video might be divisive, but it's not my intention to be divisive. I'm just trying to point certain things out. So before I end this, let me just have a final review and a final statement. We saw, by means of looking at lesbian versus homosexual gay relationships, that women seem have a much, much higher inclination to divorce for frivolous reasons. Homosexual marriages between men are much more stable than lesbian marriages. We see across the board, across different countries, that the vast majority of divorces are initiated by women. Not every country and not every series of countries offers an alimony payout and a house and custody necessarily, and yet women still initiate most of the divorces. So the universal motivation can't be the payout that Sargon had suggested, and Aaron Pizzi suggested, and the gentleman who responded to me suggested. It has to be something more frivolous. And once again, what the marriage counselor cites, and he has a lot of experience with this, is that women just aren't feeling it anymore. Their husbands are away working, providing, paying off the mortgage and doing all the work and so on and so forth. And we can say, yeah, I guess women were sort of tricked to think this, but that's pretty pathetic if they can be tricked by all this to divorce their husbands on a whim. That's not exactly very encouraging. So the way forward is to be honest about these things and to not lie to ourselves about these things. Feminists engage in enough self-deception and deception towards the world. We don't need anti-feminists doing the same thing when it's not convenient to them. I think I have no problem with anti-feminism. I'm not an anti-feminist myself. I'm not a feminist, obviously, but I don't try to refute every point feminists make because it's a waste of time, in my opinion. But if you're going to be an anti-feminist, please stay on the side of truth. Don't try to obfuscate because it might not please certain females who don't want to hear it, or it sounds divisive. Stick to the truth, stick to the facts, and I think if we stick to that, really anti-feminism could potentially dismantle feminism, at least theoretically speaking. That's all I have to say about this, but I think it was important to point these things out because it just wasn't factual what Sargon was saying, and the statements, these are statements you hear all the time. Men would do exactly the same thing. It's just not true because we know men don't because they have the options. We see this in homosexual marriages, for example. Anyway, that's all I got to say. I'll check you guys out later. Still working on that other scripted video, totally unrelated. Well, sort of. Everyone take care. Bye-bye.